stories. Jason changed my title, that's fine. But that's still what it's about, more or less. My goal today, I've got two goals. My first segment of the talk will be that all stories are theological. All stories are theological. Every narrative we consume, if it's TV shows, movies, songs, books, anything, all of it has a theology underneath it. Now, it may not be conscious to the author, but it's there. Okay? It may be very apparent, maybe deep under the surface. Why is this the case? Why are all stories theological? Well, because all stories are a creaturely reflection of the one story of God. God invented the concept of story. I don't know if we normally think about that. We know that God created the world, but everything in the world God created as well. And that goes just as well for the realm of ideas as it does for things like giraffes and people. When God created the world, he had a plan for it. We see that from Genesis to Revelation, the story of redemption history. That plan involves action through time. There's a goal, there are main characters, there's supporting characters, there's obstacles to be overcome, there are story arcs, there's everything that makes up a good story. We didn't invent these things. We looked into the world and we found them because God put them there. And then, only then did we start imitating these stories ourselves. Okay, so if we believe that the world and all of its history are God's story, that as John 1 says, Jesus is the Word, then we have to believe that ultimately the very fabric of our narratives and the fabric of the universe are inseparable from our concept of God. Is everybody tracking with me? Does that make sense? Is that persuasive to you guys?
You say it again.
Okay. If God is the inventor of story, and if God created the universe with a beginning and an end and a plot, so we see that he made it, there's a fall, there's redemption, there's consummation, all of these things that we see throughout the narrative of Scripture, if we believe that that is the goal of the universe, that's why God made things, then we have to believe that the concept of story, of narrative, of an overcoming of obstacles, is woven into the fabric of our being. And therefore, when we make these stories, we're reflecting what's already within our DNA, as it were. This story that comes from God.
Is that kind of like because we're made in the image of God?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So Tolkien and Lewis, they're very good friends. And obviously they made some really good stories. They have this concept called mythopoieia, and it comes from this Greek word that Marshall talked about in the sermon today, poiema, a making. So we make in the image of which we are made. If God is the storyteller and we're in the image of God, then we too are going to be storytellers. So that's exactly right, Jim. So that brings me to my second point. Stories have heroes and villains, right? It's a very boring story, unless it's Seinfeld, that doesn't have some sort of obstacle to be overcome. Some stories that humans choose to tell, some of the stories that we imitate the storyteller with, are in line with the gospel story, and some are not. Okay? What I want to do today is to suggest ways that we can begin to read the stories that we consume, that we partake in, but be able to read these theologically, to recognize, to evaluate whether these stories are really a good and a faithful reflection of the story of God that we're designed for, or whether they're not. Okay? Why is this important? Well, because we're shaped by the stories that we tell. Theologians like Jamie Smith and Kevin Van Hooser, who's mine and Derek's advisor over at Trinity, they want to argue that repetitive practices and the stories that we engage in, the rituals or the liturgies that make up our life, they actually change the way that we think and engage the world. So let's use an example. Let's make this concrete. Every week in service, we just got out of this, we had a prayer of confession, right? So every week when we sit in church, what comes after the prayer of confession? The assurance of pardon. Every time? Yes, every single time. So let's say that you're at home and you're praying, you're confessing your sins to God, and you say, Lord, please forgive me of my sins. Instinctively, what are you expecting to come after that? Forgiveness. Why? Because it's been ingrained in you through a repetitive practice. Confession, forgiveness, confession, forgiveness, confession, forgiveness, over and over again. Now, let's say you've soaked in that liturgy for a while. It becomes reflex. it changes the way that your mind works, okay? So let's say, for example, that every week, like I do, you watch an episode of The Flash. If you participate in that story, you, to a certain extent, become changed by that story. We enter into it, right? When you're done reading War and Peace, you're not the same person as when you started it. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes, okay. We have other repeated bodily practices that are outside the church and outside of our narratives. We have the liturgy of the shopping mall. We have the liturgy of the morning Starbucks run. All of these things go to shape how we think, how we engage the world. It's a worldview that we either knowingly or unknowingly participate in. So the danger is, the reason why I want to have this talk is, I want to make sure that we are not subconsciously being molded into people who participate in stories that are not stories of grace. Because the liturgy of the shopping mall is not the liturgy of the gospel, is it? No. That's why it's important that we learn to read these theologies, the theologies behind the stories that we're surrounded by. So, in order to kind of flesh this out, we're going to start with a story that's supremely easy to evaluate theologically, and that is the story of Superman. Now, okay, maybe that was a hint. You may be thinking, really, Austin, like Superman? But what if I started to show you these images, and I said, Superman is a theological story. It's a story that has a theology behind it. Now, you may look at these pictures. You've got Superman with the whole world in his hands. You've got him descending from heaven. And then you may start to think, maybe you have a point, Austin. So, what we're going to do is we're going to get interactive now. We're going to go through the story of Superman, which all of us know, and that is significant in itself, isn't it? Everybody here knows the story of Superman, whether you read comics or not. We're going to go through the major points of the story of Superman, and we're going to just talk about it, okay? So, his origin, where did he come from?
Krypton.
From Krypton, that's right. Krypton is another planet. How did he get here? Why?
Crash landed.
And so his dad, these two rural, pretty poor people.
This is Moses' life.
Is it?
Yeah.
Would it surprise you if I told you that the two people that invented Superman were two Jewish men? No. Okay, so he's here from Krypton. What is his mission? What's he here to do? Save the world. To fight a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. Now, what's a big part of the Superman mythology? Because he's not always in the red cape, right? He's in disguise. So there's Clark Kent. Right. In the guise of mild-mannered newspaper reporter Clark Kent, we all know the story. So a big part of Superman is what he can do, right? What are some of Superman's powers? Yeah, he can fly. He's strong. X-ray vision, that's right. He's got heat vision. He's got super breath. He's got freeze breath. He's got super hearing. You name it, right? I'm not going to list them all. It's a lot. Who's the bad guy? And what is Superman? What is Superman's value? What's he here to defend? I already said it. Truth, justice, the American way. You know, people got really upset in the new Superman movies when they took the American way out. I would debate that. That's not our talk, David.
That's not our talk.
Okay. So here we have the basics of the Superman story. Doyle, you already pointed out it's very similar to Moses, isn't it? What we have is an origin from Krypton. His father sends him, and he crash lands, and he's raised by this kindly couple out in the middle of this farmland, this rural wilderness. It's not the big city. It's not Metropolis. Besides Moses, who else does that sound like? Sent from heaven, sent from the sky. Okay. So we've got Mary and Joseph. So what was Jesus' mission? To save the world, really? Yeah. So Superman has a secret identity in which he pretends to be very humble and meek, right? And his power and his strength is somewhat hidden, would we say? Does anybody know Philippians 2? What does Philippians 2 say? Though he was in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Okay. Start to get interesting. His powers. How are you going to link Superman's powers to the Bible, Austin? Well, what if I told you that yesterday I went through the Bible and I found verses that correspond to every single one of Superman's powers?
Say you're crazy.
In Revelation, we hear that Jesus has eyes like a flame of fire. Heat vision. We see, of course, in the Ascension, he's lifted up and he's taken from our sight. He's going to come back from the sky as well. He's got super breath. The Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth. The foundations of the world are laid bare at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. By the breath of God they perish. Of course, God's got super strength. The strong arm of the Lord is all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Job, by the breath of God, ice is given. Broad waters are frozen fast. Freeze breath. He's invulnerable. The Lord's my rock and my fortress, whom I take refuge, my stronghold. He's got super speed. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. When he returns, will be like lightning, flashing from one side to the other. Does he have x-ray vision? Well, Matthew says your Father sees in secret. He looks to the ends of the earth. He sees everything that's under heaven. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching you. Now, I was pretty surprised that I found freeze breath in the Bible, but... So these powers are also pretty close to the way that we see the models and attributes of God and the glorified Christ, right? What about Lex Luthor? Does anybody have any idea how we're going to relate Lex Luthor?
Cold and ruthless enemy, as we sang about.
Yeah, if we sing Mighty Fortress is Our God. What if I told you that this word in Latin means law? What if does anybody know why Lex Luthor hates Superman?
Threat
Because he's a threat to what?
to human greatness.
He's a threat to human greatness. So this guy that comes from the sky, who's completely perfect, who can do all of these things that we can't do, and then you've got Lex Luthor, who before Superman came, was the greatest human being on earth. Everybody looked up to him, everybody worshipped his accomplishments, and now it's revealed as nothing. Filthy rags. Never be Superman. Lex Luthor hates Superman because he's a threat to his pride. Okay? Lex Luthor is a Pelagian. Do we all know what Pelagianism is? Pelagianism is works righteousness. The thought that we can be saved through our own good works, that humanity can earn its own salvation. Augustine fought against this, and he said it's by grace. Paul did too. So Superman's values, truth, justice, and the American way. Now, what if I said way, truth, well, justice should be our lives. Jesus is a different sort of life, but Jesus also is a defender of justice, isn't that true? So even the values correspond. Now, let's reflect a bit now. Would you say that so far the story of Superman has the same shape as the gospel story? Yeah. You almost begin to think, this may be deliberate. Maybe not. Like I said, he's invented by Jesus. What's missing? What's different about this story? What's a big element that's not in here? A crucifixion and a sacrifice? What if I told you that in the 90s, Superman suffered a horrifically painful death to save the world and then later was raised from the dead? That's the death of Superman storyline. Would that for some reason make us think even more, wow, this is the story of the gospel? Because of the way that Superman sacrifices himself and what comes afterwards? I think so.
He did die and was buried in the last episode.
Yeah, in Batman vs. Superman. But then we also know that he's going to be in the Justice League movie, so obviously we know what's coming after that. Next question, what's another difference about this? How does Superman save the day? Who does he save, and what does he save us from? Normally, he saves us most of the time from physical violence, right? From danger. Giant robots, talking gorillas, all that sort of stuff. He also does combat injustice a lot of the time. There's government conspiracies, there's corrupt businessmen like Lex Luthor. He does this through using his superpowers because he can do things that we can't. He rescues us, the good guys, the innocent people of Metropolis, from an external threat. Okay, he rescues the innocent from an external threat. Now I'm going to play you a couple of clips. One is from Man of Steel, and one is from Superman Returns with Brandon Routh. I'll ask you these questions again.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you. They will stumble. They will fall. But in time, they will join you when the sun's down. In time, you will help them accomplish wonders.
So we'll go to the next one.
They can be a great people color they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason above all, their capacity for good. I have sent him you, my only son.
So I'm going to ask you the questions again. What is Superman's role in relation to humanity according to these two movie clips? Yeah, he's supposed to help us by being an example, by showing us how to be better, by inspiring us, right? Now, there are Christian theologies that say this is exactly what Jesus does. Okay? That it's called the moral exemplar theory of the atonement. That Jesus only, by his death, doesn't save us from sin, but shows us how much God already loves us. Now, these are actually right as far as they go. So is the fact that he saves us from an external threat. So we know that Jesus saves us from the devil and from bondage to sin and evil. He saves us from hostile forces. He also does inspire us to be better. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's what Paul says. But what else happened? Besides these two things, what is the big thing that Jesus did? Saved us from ourselves, right? He died for us while we were sinners, while we were enemies. We are the villains of the story. We are the Lex Luthor of the gospel story. The hero is the one who doesn't punch out the bad guy. He makes dead people alive. That's the difference, okay? Now, there are other differences. Superman isn't morally perfect. He makes mistakes. He's not divine. That's a big one. Although one could argue that he is both fully Kryptonian and fully man. Now, a lot of the parallels, even over here, that we drew on the board are going to break down eventually. Just like every story, some stories are going to be right in parts and wrong in other parts. Superman is right in almost all of the parts and wrong in one, pretty much. Now, can we say, even if all stories are not perfect, that there are some stories that are better than others? There are some that are closer to the story of the gospel than others. Can we say, conversely, that there are some stories where the bad probably outweighs the good? There may be some redeeming qualities, but overall, probably not in line with God's story. Yeah? Okay. If you guys will look at the handouts that I put on the table, I've put down some questions that can maybe help us to identify some telltale signs about the theology that are underneath the stories that we tell in here. If we run out, I've got more up here. If anybody needs some, you can pass around. Thanks, Greg. Take a minute, just kind of look through those. And then I'm going to go very quickly through some of the other major kind of famous stories that we have around in our time. I'm going to ask you some of these questions, and you're going to tell me what the answers are. Because you can do this. It's not hard. All you lack is the light to show you the way. Sorry.
Are you saying you're Superman? You are kind of in his colors today, aren't you?
Was it deliberate? Was it not deliberate? I'll tell you, if my wife is here, I would have been dressed differently.
That's true.
Okay. Okay, we looked at these questions. Let's go through this. How about this one? Actually, one of my other favorite stories. What's this? Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings. Okay. So, here's Frodo, here's Sam, main characters are the hobbits. What sort of positive and negative character traits do the hobbits have?
Humble.
They're humble. They're brave. They're pretty innocent. They don't really understand it. One of the great things that my wife said to me that I've always remembered is, if you want to find out whether something is pure or not, think about whether they'd have it in the Shire. Oh, that's brilliant.
That's where the hobbits live.
Yeah. Why are Frodo and Sam heroic? What do?
They leave the Shire.
They leave the safety because why? To destroy the ring. I will take it. So they take it to Rivendell. They're saying somebody's got to take this into Mordor, into the heart of hell. And all these other brave warriors are arguing over it, and then little Frodo comes up and he says, I will take the ring, but I do not know the way. That's why he's heroic. Sam's the same thing. Sam is a gardener. But by the end of the story, we see that Sam is actually the hero of the story. What about Harry Potter? Everybody knows Harry Potter, okay? In this story, are people generally bad or generally good? They're generally bad? So let's think about, okay, in Hogwarts, you get sorted into 4 houses that are all different character traits. So you've got Hufflepuff, which is the humble, the friendship. You've got Gryffindor, who are the brave and the mighty. You've got Ravenclaw, who are the smart and the quick-witted. And then what do you have? Slytherin. And the Slytherins are really obvious, aren't they? Like, you've got this small group of people over here that are generally jerks, and then everybody else is like on the same team. You've got a few people like Voldemort or Hitler who are like really evil, and everybody else is okay. Here's another question. How do characters in Harry Potter generally react to authority figures? Are they? How many times has Harry been in detention for breaking the rules? Quite a bit. How many times does he lie in order to achieve his goal? How many times does he think for sure he knows better than Dumbledore or the people that are trying to look out for him? Quite a bit. Here's an interesting one. What's this?
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. What's Breaking Bad about, Jason?
A guy who's about to die who's breaking the law to make a lot of money.
Right. And what happens by the end of the series? I hope I'm not spoiling it for any of you guys. What does he become?
He becomes a drug kingpin.
He was a chemistry teacher and then he becomes a drug kingpin. Now, how are we supposed to feel about the character of Walter White? As the audience, what are we supposed to feel or to think about it?
We're supposed to see his descent.
To see his descent and feel what? Is he like Scarface? Is he like, yeah, macho, like, being a drug kingpin's awesome? Is that what? Yeah, it's a fall. We're supposed to feel conflicted. We're supposed to see this as a disaster, okay? Because by the end of the narrative, Walter White has destroyed himself. He's destroyed his family. It's a mess. So when I ask you, how is sin portrayed in Breaking Bad, which is a story exclusively about sin, what's the answer? It's portrayed as sinful. It's not glorified. It's not made glamorous. We're supposed to see being a drug kingpin is a really bad thing to do. It's a morality play. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? You'd think Breaking Bad is completely contrary to the story of the gospel. But it's not. Because it portrays sin for what it is.
there's the need for the gospel.
It does. Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, what about, I feel like...
I'll say about vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. But in Revelation, what does it say about vengeance? God will judge. He will destroy the wicked. That's something that we, as Western people on the North Shore, probably are not that comfortable with. But that's in the Bible. You can't escape it. God will judge the wicked. So vengeance in itself is not a bad thing. But when it becomes revenge, and when human beings take it into their hands, that's when it becomes contrary to the gospel. Because then you're making yourself into God. You're making yourself your own authority figure. So, what about Star Wars? Is there a story of redemption in Star Wars? Darth Vader. Yeah, what happens to Darth Vader?
Doesn't he die?
Yeah. He falls, he becomes evil. So he goes from being Anakin Skywalker to being a Sith Lord. And then through the love of his son, he's redeemed. And he kind of saves the day. Another question. What are the characters' opinions about fate or destiny in Star Wars? Han Solo's got a great line about this, if anybody thinks of it. There ain't no spooky energy field that's going to tell me about my destiny. Han Solo doesn't like destiny. What does Luke think about it? He kind of accepts the role of the Force in his life, doesn't he? We've got kind of a mixed picture in Star Wars. Some people are against it, some people are for it. Something that's not on the sheet, but that's a big part of Star Wars, there is a mystical element to it. What's it called? The Force. And what is it about the Force? The Force. There's a dark side, there's a light side. It's an impersonal energy field. Everybody can kind of tap into it. That sounds like dualism. So there is a kind of an explicit religious element in Star Wars, but it's not the Christian one. It's an Eastern picture of how things go. There's no personal deity in Star Wars. So while a lot of Star Wars is about good versus evil, there's redemption in here. Underlying it is a concept of impersonal fate or dualism that's not necessarily in line with Christianity. Now, don't get me wrong. I have Star Wars action figures on my desk at work. So all of these shows I love. Okay, I'm a fan of these. But we have to be conscious of the divergences and the similarities. That's what I'm saying. Last one. What's this?
Walking Dead.
The Walking Dead. Okay. Now, Walking Dead is not over yet, but there are smaller conclusions and resolutions throughout the picture. And overall, would you say that this show has been happy or sad?
Extremely sad.
Extremely sad, with like little beacons of hope and little things of happiness. Sometimes they're crushed, because the world's a harsh place. Right. The goodness that you get in the world is something that you have to take with a knife and a crossbow. Are there any spiritual or religious characters in The Walking Dead? Does anybody know?
There's a pastor.
There is a pastor. How do the other characters view this Pastor Gabriel?
Well, he betrays.
Yeah, he does betray them. He's portrayed a little bit kind of as a hypocrite because he let his congregation die. Everybody else, Rick especially, thinks he's kind of weird, doesn't trust him. Now, Gabriel starts to get more positively portrayed in the show when he decides that he's going to help them kill people. Contrast that with Lord of the Rings. Are there any spiritual characters in Lord of the Rings? Gandalf the White. How's Gandalf portrayed? He's a hero. Everybody loves Gandalf. Gandalf is wise, he's good, he's just. He's portrayed positively. Now, hopefully, this is it. This is the presentation. We've kind of gone through, we've been practiced in this. Hopefully this has got some of your gears turning. I think it's more dangerous, personally, to consume our media unreflectively because these aren't just stories, okay? Every story has a worldview inside of it. Whether the author means it to be there or not, it's there. Every single story. We need to be wise and discerning in how we evaluate which stories we let ourselves inhabit. Now, I think it's fun to watch Walking Dead. It's one of my favorite shows on television. But I need to know when The Walking Dead is diverging from the story of God and when it's in line with it. And to hold myself back when I should, to let myself in when I should, because the gospel should rule the way we think and evaluate everything else in the world.
But how can you really do that? I mean, I just think if you let these ideas soak in, sometimes you're not that strong to pull them out. I mean, like, I think there are some shows that just, you're just bombarded. Like, how do you know for sure you can stay on that path?
What does Jesus say about that? He says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye leads you to sin, pluck it out. There are some shows that I watch, shows that I do not include here. I refuse to watch them because the things that I need to hold myself back from are so pervasive or outweigh the good so much that it's just not worth it to me. It's just not. I'm not going to put myself through that.
Austin?
Yes.
Greg and I still watch Lawrence Welk.
Watch what?
Violation of good taste.
You know what Lawrence Welk is?
I know that Lawrence Welk is a variety show host, but that's it. Now I'm not going to stand up here and tell you which shows you need to watch and which books you need to stop reading. Okay, you need to exercise discernment on that for your own, with yourself, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and people that you trust. That's not my place. But I do want to make sure that we're asking the exact kind of questions that you're asking, Jill. When is it just not worth it? When would it be too much for me to participate in this? That's what I want to get us to think about here. Hopefully, we've started to see what sort of questions we can pull out from the underlying narratives that we're consuming, and begin to take more seriously these narratives that we're being shaped by in the world.
Austin, what would you say are the dangerous? I mean, because like something that's like pornographic or excessively violent, that's a little bit easier. But what are the dangerous stories?
The most dangerous stories to me are not the stories where there's nudity on every episode, or the stories where the image of God and humanity is being degraded through perverse violence. They're the stories that are actually the most frequent. The stories where it's one man or woman against the world, and they know what's right, and they're gonna go by their own standards and let everybody else be damned, right? Not the government, not the church, it's me. I know what's right, I'm on a one-man crusade for justice. Because what is that? It's idolatry. It's self-worship. The story of the exalted self, I am the captain of my fate, I am the master of my soul. That's the one that's perhaps the most pervasive and the most insidious that we hear over and over again in the United States. And those are perhaps the ones that I think would be the most dangerous. What
about like a Woody Allen movie?
Yeah.
You know, I've been thinking about like what's a really great example of that. And The Flash. House of Cards. That's a really obvious one. That's good. What do you guys think? I've given my talk. Let's let you guys read this theologically.
I think it could be more innocuous, friendly stories that it's like they're characters that you really aspire to, but they're values that are contrary to gospel.
So
it's like it's sneakier.
Yeah. So has anybody seen the new Jungle Book?
No.
I haven't seen it either, but my best friend has, and he said that he didn't like it because the moral of the new Jungle Book story, you know, Mowgli is a human, he lives in the world of animals, and all the other animals kind of think he's weird. The moral of the story is, I don't have to change who I am to be happy. I can be happy on my own. I can use my pack when it's convenient for me, but they don't define who I am. That's one that is packaged in a children's story. But what's it telling us? It's telling us, I am the master of my fate, I'm the captain of my soul. Right?
Frozen.
Frozen. Well, actually, I was thinking about this. Frozen was one that I came up with. So at the Let It Go song that's burned into your synapses by now, the point of the song is, I don't want any of these responsibilities. Nobody can tell me what I'm going to be. I'm going to be totally free, right? I'm going to be happy whatever way I can, whether it's sexual liberation, whether it's shunting off responsibilities of family. I'm going to determine my own happiness. But what's actually the moral of the movie of Frozen?
When you do that, everything goes to a frozen hell.
Everything turns out terribly.
Yeah.
So we see in Frozen, I think that's what's brilliant about that movie, is that it foregrounds what everybody's expecting this fairy tale to be about. Every Disney movie is basically about I'm gonna be happy, I'm gonna find my true love, and that's gonna make my life perfect. And it starts off that way, but then it kind of goes into realism. They say, are you really gonna marry a man you just met? And she says, yes, I am, I love him. And then what happens? He's a villain. She says, I'm gonna create my ice palace and I'm gonna freeze, because that's what makes me happy, and I I hate being confined by the strictures of society. But then what happens? She almost dies. She's got to be rescued. I think Frozen is a Christian story, actually.
Friends.
Friends.
That show destroyed a generation.
Yeah.
Sex in the City.
That's to me sounds like what you're saying about idolatry. Like Sex in the City is like each of these three characters is trying to go out and find themselves, and you know, and whatever their relationship was like their ultimate thing, and it changed every episode. But it was always about them and that relationship. And the same with what was the other one?
Friends.
Well, the thing about that is that they're funny and things go wrong, but at the same time, like,
we all know that this is what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah,
I mean, the shoes are so beautiful, I want it. I mean, like, let's be honest. I mean, that's why people like Sex in the City. Like, I want those shoes.
You know, I couldn't comment on that, Marshall, but it sounds like you did a good job.
See my shoes?
Very nice shoes. Mention it.
So yeah, you guys are beginning to pick up. Let me ask. Yeah.
You're not saying create a good list of necessarily good stories and bad stories and just watch them. You're just saying be aware.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, just think about it. That's what I'm saying. And if like Jill, you decide that you're not strong enough, or you think the story is too powerful to let yourself be put into, maybe just don't do it. You know, you don't have to watch Game of Thrones if you feel like that you and like personally will not benefit from it, or if it will harm you spiritually. Even if everybody talks about it on Monday when they come back from work, so what?
And some of the works that we think might, if we come from a very cautious viewpoint, we might put on a do not consume list, may actually show us the reality of what happens when sin reigns,
right,
and may point up further, if we can think it through,
right,
the need for a Savior.
That's why I think Breaking Bad was such a fascinating example why I put it on here. Because originally I was like, no, Mandy wanted to watch it, it was on Netflix. I said, absolutely not, I'm not going to participate in that. It's all about sin. And then it just so happened that she was watching it while I was in the room studying. And I said, this is really good. And it subverted my expectations because it portrayed it really realistically. Like, even though Walter White thinks he's a big shot, at the end of the series, he says, you know, he starts out thinking, I'm going to do this to save my family. But he admits at the end of the series, I didn't do this for you. I did this for me. That's real. That's how it really goes. Even Puritans, who we think to be so straight-laced and buttoned up, they had morality plays. You know, the Rake's Progress. That's not Puritan, but it's the same way. You can see the gospel just as well by its absence as by its presence sometimes. I think that's good.
Did you come up with any thinking about the author of these works? Is there, for instance, you said Superman, the authors are Jewish. Is there an agenda that they have? Do they have it, or is it like a DNA template that we're all part of God's story, so it's going to leak out? Or if you're covering it, it might not be there at all.
Yeah, I think that, number one, our worldview is going to go into our stories whether we want it to or not. Some people make it more obvious and make it more deliberate. So has anybody heard of the Golden Compass?
Yeah.
Okay, the Golden Compass is written by a guy who read the Chronicles of Narnia when he was young, and then realized it was about the gospel and hated it. Became an atheist, and he said, I'm going to write the anti-Narnia. I'm going to write the secular humanist Chronicles of Narnia, and that's what the Golden Compass is. He did that very deliberately. Some people don't. Some people do.
I think sometimes you can rationalize, like, oh, I can watch this because I can see the difference, you know, I can kind of see, kind of what you were saying, Joy. Like, you know, I can see the gospel in this, or I can see how it deviates from the gospel. But sometimes I feel like, I don't know, there's a danger in that a little bit too.
To stay bathing in the mud for too long is dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, like the Murphy Brown narrative of 25 years ago with, you were probably 4, but like Murphy Brown was the first single mother on TV. Dan Quayle made a big deal about it in the '92 election, and it was this big cultural thing. I mean, like the thought of a single mother on TV being a big deal is so antiquated right now. I mean, in 2016, I was in high school. I remember that. I'm saying that the narrative has moved so quickly from what was, I mean, it was a cultural deal that there was a single mom on TV, Murphy Brown.
Now what's the controversy? So the controversy now is that in Finding Dory, the sequel to Finding Nemo, they're saying, oh, is there a lesbian couple with a child in the trailer? That's now the controversy. We see, I think in television, in movies, it's less prevalent. In television shows, we see it change much more rapidly, because what's kind of the #1 comedy on television right now? It's Modern Family, right? What does Modern Family say about marriage and the family and sex and kind of the values of the household? You know, I'm not saying don't watch it. I'm saying, so just as I love Superman, and I can see all of this great stuff about how Superman can illustrate the gospel, I look at how does Superman save us? You know, I've sent you my only son because of their capacity for good. I just go, hold on. Now, it doesn't mean I don't read Superman. I do. It means that when I see that, I put next to it the Bible. And I say, this Bible, this trumps the Superman narrative.
But some people would take both of those on the same playing field and saying our scripture is a mythology that's man-made. So I think, the Romans had their mythology, but I don't think anyone really believed it.
Yeah, that's debated. I mean, I think that definitely the philosophers and the more erudite people would try to demythologize it to make it into a philosophy rather than a religion.
Yeah.
I don't know, but that's true. I mean, some people. What would you do if somebody says your Bible is just another story?
Yeah.
Why would you elevate this?
You have to go with the testimony that we heard of the girl who was baptized, and she did the scientific. There's a basis that we have. There was a real Mary and Joseph. There was a Bethlehem. There was a birth. There was a crucifixion and so forth like that.
Do you guys know the narrative of C.S. Lewis's conversion? I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So C.S. Lewis grew up Belfast, Ireland, kind of left the faith when he became a rebellious teenager, became a very ardent atheist, and he's reading all these myths, things like Joseph Fraser's Golden Branch, all this comparative mythology. And one of his friends at Oxford says, one thing about this dying and rising God myth, you think it almost happened once. This is so prevalent. And as he gets to thinking, after he becomes a Christian, he said, what should we think about the fact that there are all sorts of mythologies that seem to echo and be very similar to the Christian story? He says, well, if you believe that the incarnation and resurrection is the focal point of history, it's like a pebble being dropped into a pond. It's going to ripple outward into the whole rest of the world. That's what I started with in the talk, is that this story, the story of fall, incarnation, resurrection, redemption, glorification, that's how the world is made. That's how we expect stories to go, because we're in the image of God. Now, I watched fairly recently this show called The Last Kingdom. It's on BBC. It's about the Viking invasion and Albert the Great in the 800s. And as I watched this story, there was a way that I was expecting it to play out. Like at one point, he leaves his wife, and he finds this sorceress that he becomes romantically involved in. And Mandy said, "This show's terrible. I don't want to watch this anymore." I said, "No, just watch. He'll come back to his wife. He'll see that the sorceress was evil. She's tricking him, and he'll come back to his wife." That didn't happen. I said, "That's not a good story. It should have happened this way." And the more I did research on the author of the original books that they made the story of, I realized that he's an atheist. And he was probably doing that very deliberately. He was contravening the normative narrative standards that we're all built into to tell a different story.
Happy ending.
Happy ending for that guy, according to that narrative. Does anybody else have any other comments on this?
Can I get a picture of the Superman second?
Sure. Thank you guys for coming. I don't think we all have to wait for Jill's.
Feel that you've got your own Superman right next to you.
Mister.
We'll do this again in
He's a comic book character called Mister.
This is the first time that we've ever had a lecture at Grace that has incorporated a GIF.
I love it.
It was great.
That's pretty amazing. And we'll do this again in July, different topic. And are you next, Derek? Or
I don't remember if it's me or Mario.
okay, so the July TED's talk will either be Derek Rishmawi or Mario on a different topic from their expertise, where they get to come and share their passions. So tell your friends.
I think Derek's going to do Batman.
Probably be non-comic book mythology based, I'm guessing. But interesting topic that they want to speak to us about. So in July, we'll let you know. We hope you can come back again. Thank you guys. Thanks.